Imagine a building that contained every book ever written.
Not a metaphor, a literal attempt to collect every scroll, every manuscript, every piece of written knowledge that existed on Earth. A building where scholars from across the ancient world could come to read works they could find nowhere else. A building that contained original manuscripts of Aristotle, plays by Sophocles that no longer exist, mathematical proofs, astronomical observations, medical treatises, histories, poetry, the accumulated intellectual output of thousands of years of human civilization.
Now imagine that building burning to the ground.
The Library of Alexandria was, depending on who you ask, either the greatest cultural catastrophe in human history or a slightly overblown legend. The truth, as with most things, is somewhere in the middle, and it's more interesting than either extreme. This is the story of what the library actually was, what it actually contained, how it actually ended, and what the world lost when it did.
Because the question of the library is not really a question about books.
It's a question about what civilization loses when it decides that certain knowledge isn't worth preserving. And it turns out that question is just as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. The Library of Alexandria was founded sometime in the early 3rd century BC, in the city of Alexandria in Egypt, the city that Alexander the Great had founded and that his successors, the Ptolemaic dynasty, had turned into the intellectual capital of the ancient world. Alexandria was, by any measure, the most important city on Earth at that time.
It was the largest city in the Mediterranean. It was the center of international trade. And it was home to a royal dynasty that had decided, for reasons both genuine and self-serving, that they wanted to own all the knowledge in the world. The library was founded by Ptolemy I and expanded by his son Ptolemy II, in a program of intellectual acquisition that was, by ancient standards, almost comically aggressive. The Ptolemies wanted every book. Not copies of every book.
Ancient sources describe agents sent across the Mediterranean world with orders to purchase manuscripts. Every ship that docked in Alexandria harbor was searched for books, which were confiscated, copied, and sometimes not returned. When Athens lent Alexandria the official state copies of the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides to be copied, the Ptolemies paid a fortune in gold as a deposit and then kept the originals, returning the copies instead. The library eventually grew to hold somewhere between 40,000 and 700,000 scrolls, depending on which ancient source you believe. The range is enormous because the ancients themselves disagreed, and because a single scroll might contain a few pages or an entire major work. What is clear is that the library was genuinely the largest collection of written knowledge in the ancient world, and that scholars traveled from across the Mediterranean to study there. The library was part of a larger institution called the Mouseion, literally the Temple of the Muses, from which we get our word museum. It was something like a combination of a research university, a library, and a think tank. Scholars lived there, received salaries from the state, and were expected to produce new knowledge. Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy in the 3rd century BC, was the chief librarian.
Euclid, whose geometry textbook was still in use in the 20th century AD, worked in Alexandria.
Herophilus, who performed the first systematic human dissections and founded the science of anatomy, conducted his research there.
So when did the library burn? Here is where the story gets complicated, because the honest answer is, we don't fully know. The popular image is of a single catastrophic fire, usually blamed on Julius Caesar, that destroyed everything in one night. The reality is messier and in some ways more disturbing. There is evidence of at least 3 separate significant incidents, spread across 6 centuries.
The first incident associated with Caesar occurred in 48 BC, when Caesar was besieged in Alexandria during a civil war. To prevent the Egyptian fleet from being used against him, Caesar ordered ships in the harbor to be set on fire.
Ancient sources disagree sharply about what happened next.
Some say the fire spread to the city and destroyed the library. Others say the fire burned a warehouse of books near the harbor, possibly an overflow storage facility, but never reached the main library. Modern scholars generally believe this incident damaged or destroyed a significant collection, but probably not the library itself. The second major incident came in 391 AD, when the Roman Emperor Theodosius issued a decree ordering the destruction of pagan temples throughout the empire. In Alexandria, this led to riots and the destruction of the Serapeum, a large temple complex that housed a secondary library, sometimes called the daughter library, containing hundreds of thousands of scrolls. The main library may already have declined by this point. There are no references to it in sources after the 3rd century AD, but the destruction of the Serapeum was certainly a major cultural loss. The third incident is the one often cited as the final blow, the Arab conquest of Egypt in 642 AD, and a story in which the Arab general Amr ibn al-As asked the Caliph Omar what to do with the library. The Caliph's reply, as the story goes, if the books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree, they are dangerous. Burn them. Historians today generally believe this story is a later invention. But whether it happened or not, the library as an institution was certainly gone by the time the Arabs arrived. What did we actually lose? This is the question that haunts historians of the ancient world, because the answer is, we genuinely don't know, and that is precisely the problem. We know certain things are gone because ancient authors refer to them. Aristotle wrote somewhere between 150 and 200 works. We have 31. The rest are known only through references and fragments. The playwright Sophocles wrote over 120 plays. We have 7. Euripides wrote around 90 plays. We have 19. We know from references that scientists in Alexandria were studying the mechanics of steam power. One ancient source describes a device that used steam to spin a metal ball, what would today be recognized as the first steam engine, but the treatises explaining it are gone. We know that Aristarchus of Samos argued, in the 3rd century BC, that the Earth orbited the Sun. His original work is lost. We only know his theory because Archimedes mentioned it while disagreeing with it. Think about what that means. A Greek astronomer correctly described the heliocentric solar system 17 centuries before Copernicus, and his work was so completely lost that when Copernicus proposed the same idea in 1543, he was considered a radical revolutionary. What else was in those lost scrolls? What medical discoveries were made and then forgotten? What mathematical insights? What geographical knowledge? We will never know. And that, in many ways, is the most disturbing aspect of the library's loss, not the books we know were destroyed, but the ideas that were developed, written down, and then simply ceased to exist. Civilizations can rebuild buildings. They cannot recover knowledge that has been completely erased. There is a coda to this story that is worth telling. In 2002, Egypt opened a new library in Alexandria, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, built on the site believed to be close to the original. It is a stunning building, designed to hold 8 million books, with a reading room that can seat 2,000 scholars simultaneously. It is, in some sense, an attempt to recapture something that was lost. But the deeper lesson of the Library of Alexandria is not about libraries. It is about what societies choose to value, preserve, and pass on. The ancient library survived as long as it did because powerful rulers considered the preservation of knowledge to be worth spending enormous resources on. When that commitment weakened, when political instability, religious conflict, and changing priorities made maintaining the library less important than other things, the knowledge began to disappear. It did not disappear in a single dramatic fire. It disappeared gradually, over centuries, as scrolls were not recopied when they became too fragile, as scholars moved elsewhere, as funding dried up, as the institution slowly lost its purpose. The fire stories are dramatic. The reality is more mundane and more instructive. The Library of Alexandria did not burn down. It was neglected to death. The books that survived from the ancient world survived because scribes in monasteries across Europe and the Middle East, often working in difficult conditions with limited resources, made the choice to keep copying them, generation after generation, for over 1,000 years. We owe the preservation of Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, and dozens of other ancient authors not to any grand institution, but to individual human beings who decided that these words were worth preserving. That is a story about choices. And it is still being written.